On August 10, 2019, at 6:30 in the morning, a guard finds Jeffrey Epstein's body hanging in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The two cameras that were supposed to monitor the corridor had not been recording for hours. The two guards assigned to his custody had fallen asleep. His cellmate had been transferred the previous day, breaking the usual protocol. Epstein, the man who for 20 years had built an empire of money, power, and silence around his crimes, died alone without anyone seeing anything in the most closely guarded federal prison in the country. Jeffrey Edward Epstein is born on January 20, 1953, in the Seagate neighborhood of Coney Island, Brooklyn. His parents, Seymour and Pauline, are a middle-class Jewish family. Seymour works as a gardener for the New York City Parks Department. Epstein grows up with a younger brother, Mark, and stands out from a young age for his aptitude for mathematics. He enrolls at Cooper Union and then at New York University, but leaves both without obtaining a degree. Despite this, in 1974 he secures a position as a mathematics and physics teacher at the Dalton School, an elite private school in Manhattan. The contradiction draws the attention of several investigators years later. A young man without a university diploma teaching at one of the most exclusive schools in New York. The school's own headmaster would later acknowledge that the hiring bypassed the usual qualification procedures required of any other teacher. At Dalton, Epstein teaches for 2 years, a period during which he already draws comments from students and colleagues because of his unusual closeness with some teenage female students, episodes that at the time do not lead to a formal complaint but resurface years later in accounts from former students. It is also during this period that he meets Alan Greenberg, then chairman of Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most powerful investment banks. The father of a student recommends him for a position at the firm. In 1976, with no formal financial experience or university degree, Epstein begins working at Bear Stearns as an assistant stock trader. He rises with unusual speed for someone without formal training. Within a few years, he becomes a limited partner at the firm, specializing in stock options and the management of large family fortunes, an area that allows him to come into direct contact with some of the largest fortunes in the United States. In 1981, he is abruptly dismissed. The reasons never become entirely clear. Different accounts speak of a violation of Securities and Exchange Commission rules, an unreported loan to a subordinate employee, or internal conflicts with other partners. Epstein never offers a satisfactory public explanation, and Bear Stearns itself avoids commenting on the episode for decades. After leaving Bear Stearns, Epstein founds his own financial consulting firm. In 1982, he creates J. Epstein and Company, which later becomes Financial Trust Company, registered in the United States Virgin Islands, a territory with tax advantages and less regulatory oversight. In its early years, the firm presents itself to potential clients with a peculiar requirement. It only works for people with a net worth of more than $1 billion, which in practice reduces its client base to a handful of individuals. The decisive turning point comes in 1987, when Epstein begins working for Leslie Wexner, founder of Limited Brands, the parent company of brands such as Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works. Wexner, one of the richest men in the United States, grants Epstein almost total power over his personal finances, something exceptional even among the closest wealth management relationships. Epstein receives power of attorney over Wexner's accounts, signs documents on his behalf, manages his properties, and becomes, according to what various journalistic and judicial investigations later reconstructed, the only known client of his firm for much of those years. This relationship is key to understanding the origin of Epstein's fortune, which for decades remains shrouded in mystery. Unlike other wealth managers, Epstein never discloses a public list of clients or presents regulators with a record of transactions comparable to the size of his wealth. Thanks to his connection with Wexner, in 1996 he acquires a 7-story mansion of approximately 2,000 square meters at 9 East 71st Street in Manhattan, considered one of the largest private residences in the city and transferred by Wexner himself for a sum that is never publicly disclosed. Added to this property are a ranch of more than 9,000 hectares in New Mexico called Zorro Ranch, an apartment in Paris, an estate in Palm Beach known as El Brillo, and from 1998 onward, a private island in the Caribbean, Little St. James, in the United States Virgin Islands. Subsequent investigations, including a lawsuit filed in 2022 by the government of the United States Virgin Islands against the banking entity J.P. Morgan Chase, maintain that Epstein used opaque financial structures to move funds for years without triggering internal alerts, and accuse the bank of having facilitated, supported, and concealed the human trafficking network run by Epstein, despite warning signs documented by its own compliance employees. J.P. Morgan ultimately pays $75 million to settle that lawsuit, while Deutsche Bank, which managed Epstein's accounts after his departure from J.P. Morgan, agrees to pay $75 million in 2023 to settle a class action lawsuit by victims on similar grounds. Wexner, for his part, would state in 2019 that he had severed ties with Epstein in 2007 after discovering that he had misappropriated funds from his assets without publicly specifying the exact amount. The opacity of these operations constitutes one of the first great mysteries of Epstein's biography. No one outside his closest circle ever fully understands how a former mathematics teacher without a client portfolio ends up accumulating hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. During the 1990s and 2000s, Epstein systematically devotes himself to building a network of relationships with influential people, business people, scientists, politicians, academics, and members of royalty. He funds research at universities such as Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, donates millions of dollars to scientific projects, and organizes conferences on artificial intelligence, theoretical physics, and philanthropy at his mansion and on his island. Among the names linked to Epstein during these years are former President Bill Clinton, who travels on multiple occasions on Epstein's private plane, nicknamed by the press the Lolita Express. Prince Andrew of the United Kingdom, who maintains a friendship with Epstein for years. Economist Larry Summers. Lawyer Alan Dershowitz, and businessman Donald Trump, who encounters Epstein at social events in New York and Palm Beach from the late 1980s until the mid-2000s. In a 2002 interview reported by New York Magazine, Trump describes Epstein as a terrific person who is fun to be with and comments that he likes young women. The relationship between Epstein and Trump breaks down in 2004, when both bid for the same property at an auction in Palm Beach, the Maison de l'Amitié mansion. Trump wins the bid for more than $41 million in what the auctioneer himself describes as the clash of two major Palm Beach egos. According to various journalistic sources, the relationship between the two deteriorates definitively during those years, although Trump would later claim to have expelled Epstein from his Mar-a-Lago club sometime earlier for attempting to recruit female employees from the club. This network of contacts is not accidental. Epstein uses it as a way to project legitimacy and power, and also, as multiple investigations would later reveal, as a protection mechanism. The more influential people surround him, the more difficult it becomes for the authorities to treat him as an ordinary criminal. Parallel to the construction of his social network, Epstein systematically invests in presenting himself as a patron of science. He creates the Jeffrey Epstein VI Foundation and funds programs at institutions such as Harvard University, where between 2003 and 2007 he donates more than $6 million to create a research program in evolutionary biology and cognitive science, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where his money reaches the media laboratory through donations that in some cases are recorded anonymously or through intermediaries, a mechanism that comes to light in 2019 and leads to the resignation of Joichi Ito, then director of the laboratory. Epstein also organizes private gatherings that bring together scientists, technology entrepreneurs, and Nobel Prize winners at his New York mansion and on his Caribbean island, under the label of conferences on artificial intelligence, quantum physics, and the limits of human knowledge. Over the years, physicists, geneticists, and internationally renowned science communicators attend these gatherings, drawn in many cases by access to funding that would otherwise be difficult to obtain for experimental or unconventional lines of research. Physicist Stephen Hawking attends a conference organized by Epstein in 2006 aboard a ship off the Virgin Islands, an episode that publicly resurfaces years later in the context of investigations into Epstein's network, with no evidence that Hawking had knowledge of the crimes being committed in parallel at his host's properties. In the case of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the 2019 journalistic investigation reveals that Epstein donated at least $800,000 to the media laboratory between 2013 and 2017, largely recorded internally under the label of anonymous donor or attributed to other people to conceal its origin, a practice that Joichi Ito himself publicly acknowledges before submitting his resignation as director of the laboratory in September 2019. The revelation also reaches other employees of the institution who admit having managed the donations with full knowledge of the donor's true identity despite the 2008 conviction. These gatherings, combined with donations to cancer research and his closeness to figures in the academic world, allow Epstein to build a reputation as a philanthropist interested in the future of science, an image that serves as a public counterweight to the rumors about his conduct with minors that circulate privately in several social circles from the late 1990s onward. Epstein buys Little St. James in 1998 for $7.95 million. The island, covering approximately 35 hectares, becomes the central setting for much of the abuse that dozens of victims and several federal investigations would later document, to the point that local employees begin unofficially referring to it as Pedophile Island, years before the case publicly erupts. Employees and pilots testify years later that they transported young women, many of them minors, from different parts of the United States to the island, recording the flights in logs that would later become key judicial evidence publicly known as the flight logs of the Lolita Express. Several villas are built on the site, a pyramid-shaped stone temple whose internal use is never fully clarified, and security systems that include cameras distributed throughout practically the entire property. According to testimony collected in the judicial proceedings, Epstein used these cameras not only for surveillance, but also to record his visitors in compromising situations, a possible mechanism of control and pressure over the people in his circle, although the final whereabouts of much of that audiovisual material has never been clearly established before the public. The recruitment mechanism followed, according to dozens of consistent testimonies collected in different judicial proceedings, a pyramid structure. A recruited young woman was then financially encouraged to recruit others, expanding the network without Epstein or Maxwell having to expose themselves directly in each initial contact. Many of the victims came from economically vulnerable backgrounds, and the same pattern is repeated in the testimonies: the offer of cash, between $200 and $300, in exchange for giving a massage that later led to abuse. Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of British media magnate Robert Maxwell, becomes Epstein's partner and later his principal collaborator from the mid-1990s onward. As the United States justice system would establish years later, Maxwell actively participates in the recruitment of minors, often under the pretext of offering them jobs as massage therapists, and in their transportation to Epstein's properties. In March 2005, the Palm Beach police open an investigation after the parents of a 14-year-old girl report that Epstein paid her to give him a massage that led to sexual abuse. The investigation, led by Detective Joseph Recaray and internally dubbed Operation Leap Year, quickly identifies a pattern. Several young individuals are taken to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion to perform massages that end in serious misconduct. The targeted individuals were recruited by other young women through a pyramid-style scheme, a process the police themselves documented via surveillance and searches of the residence's trash, where they found notes and appointment books containing the contact details of dozens of young contacts. The police gather sufficient evidence to bring dozens of charges that include felonies. However, Palm Beach State Attorney Barry Krischer decides to take the case before a grand jury instead of filing charges directly, an unusual decision that drastically reduces the scope of the indictment. The grand jury hears testimony from only one victim and ultimately indicts Epstein on a single state charge: solicitation of prostitution. The leniency of the charge causes discontent within the Palm Beach police, whose chief, Michael Reiter, publicly accuses Krischer of giving Epstein preferential treatment and refers the case directly to the FBI. The FBI then opens a parallel federal investigation, the aforementioned Operation Leap Year at the federal level, which identifies more than 36 possible underage victims. In 2007, while federal prosecutors prepare a 53-page indictment that could have resulted in life imprisonment for Epstein, his team of lawyers, which includes Alan Dershowitz, Roy Black, and Kenneth Starr, negotiates directly for months with Alexander Acosta, then United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. Emails later obtained by the Miami Herald show that Acosta repeatedly gives in to requests from Epstein's legal team. The result is an extraordinarily favorable federal non-prosecution agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to 2 state charges of solicitation of prostitution involving a minor, the federal government declines to prosecute him for the sex trafficking offenses that could be proven against him. And the agreement unusually also shields Epstein's possible unidentified accomplices in advance from any future federal charges. The agreement is kept secret and the victims are not informed, which years later, in 2019, a federal judge would determine violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Epstein pleads guilty in June 2008 and is sentenced to only 18 months in jail, of which he serves fewer than 13. During his confinement at the Palm Beach County Detention Facility, he is allowed to leave the building for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, under the so-called work release program, to go to an office rented by himself, under the supervision of private guards paid by him. Upon leaving prison in 2009, he is required to register as a sex offender, a requirement that, according to subsequent investigations, he repeatedly fails to comply with without the authorities taking action. Between 2009 and 2019, Epstein continues to move freely within the same social circles as before his conviction. He launches a public relations campaign aimed at rebuilding his image, presenting himself as a philanthropist and patron of science, and maintains meetings and correspondence with bankers, academics, and politicians who, as would later become known, were not completely unaware of the background of his 2008 conviction. During this period, according to what multiple testimonies and court documents would later establish, the sexual abuse of minors and young women continues, both at his New York mansion and in Palm Beach and Little St. James. Virginia Giuffre, one of the victims who would later become a public voice in the case, states that she was recruited by Maxwell at the age of 16 in 2000 while working at the spa of the Mar-a-Lago Golf Club owned by Trump, and that she was subsequently transported by Epstein and Maxwell for several years to have sexual encounters with men in their circle, including, according to her testimony, Prince Andrew, on 3 separate occasions between 2001 and 2002 in London, New York, and Little St. James. Among the documented meetings from this period, the relationship between Epstein and Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, stands out as Gates meets with him on multiple occasions between 2011 and 2014, meetings that Gates would later justify as related to possible philanthropic donations through his foundation, although emails published subsequently show a closer relationship than both parties initially acknowledged. Epstein also organizes several dinners and meetings in 2015 and 2018 at his New York mansion, attended by scientists, technology entrepreneurs, and on some occasions, entertainment figures, gatherings that at the time are presented as intellectual evenings and are later cited as part of his continued strategy of projecting respectability. In 2015, Giuffre files a defamation lawsuit against Maxwell after Maxwell publicly accuses her of lying. The civil proceedings, which continue for years and are resolved in 2017 with a confidential financial settlement, nevertheless force the subsequent release of thousands of pages of documents, sworn statements and emails that ultimately reconstruct much of the structure of Epstein's network, including the names of employees, pilots and other alleged victims who until then had not come to light. In November 2018, the Miami Herald publishes an investigative series titled Perversion of Justice, which reconstructs in detail how the 2008 agreement was arranged and Acosta's role, who at that time holds the position of Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration. The impact of the series renews public and judicial interest in the case. In December 2018, the FBI and the Federal Prosecutor's Office in Manhattan open a new investigation into Epstein, this time without the territorial limitations that the Florida case had faced. Before Epstein's second arrest, a civil proceeding less well known to the public proves decisive in exposing the irregularities of the 2007 agreement. In 2008, shortly after the non-prosecution agreement becomes known, two of the victims, identified in court as Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2, file a lawsuit against the United States government alleging that the prosecutor's office violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by negotiating the agreement without informing or consulting them, as that federal legislation requires for any agreement of this kind. The proceedings, known as Doe versus United States, continue for more than a decade in the federal courts of Florida. In February 2019, just months before Epstein's second arrest, federal judge Kenneth Mara rules in favor of the victims and formally determines that the Department of Justice violated their legal rights by concealing the existence of the agreement from them before it was signed. Although the ruling does not invalidate the original agreement, it legally strengthens the arguments that months later allow the New York Prosecutor's Office to explain before the court why the 2007 agreement, limited to Florida and flawed in its handling, does not prevent a new federal indictment in another judicial district. On July 6, 2019, Epstein is arrested by federal agents at Teterboro Airport, New Jersey, when his private jet lands from Paris. New York prosecutors argue that they are not bound by the 2008 immunity agreement signed by a different prosecutor's office and limited to Florida. That same day, 20 FBI agents search his Manhattan mansion and find hundreds, possibly thousands, of photographs of naked or partially naked women, including minors, as well as a hidden hard drive and an Austrian passport bearing his photograph, a false name and a false address in Saudi Arabia, a document dating from the 1980s that Epstein allegedly used, according to his own statements to acquaintances, while traveling on matters that he himself described as connected to intelligence services. Epstein is formally charged with sex trafficking and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors, with charges involving dozens of victims between 2002 and 2005 and carrying a potential sentence of up to 45 years in prison. He pleads not guilty before the federal court in Manhattan. Days after the arrest, Acosta resigns from his position as Secretary of Labor amid public pressure over his role in the original 2008 agreement. His defense requests release on bail, offering his Manhattan mansion as collateral, a request that Judge Richard Berman rejects on the grounds that Epstein represents a flight risk given his wealth, his properties abroad, and his history. He is then admitted to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a maximum security facility where he remains in custody awaiting trial, housed in the special high-security unit normally reserved for high-profile prisoners. Days after the arrest, Acosta holds a press conference to publicly defend his role in the 2007 agreement, arguing that at the time it represented the best available option to secure at least one conviction, given that he considered the outcome of a possible jury trial uncertain. The explanation fails to contain the public pressure, and on July 12, 2019, he submits his resignation as Secretary of Labor. For its part, the New York Prosecutor's Office states in the court documents of the new case that between Palm Beach and Manhattan alone, it identifies more than 30 additional victims beyond those already known from the 2008 proceedings, raising to more than 100 the total number of women and girls who over the years state that they were victims of Epstein at some point between the late 1990s and 2019. On July 23, 2019, barely 2 weeks after his admission, Epstein is found semi-conscious in his cell with marks on his neck in what the authorities interpret as a possible suicide attempt or, according to other accounts never officially confirmed, a possible attack by his cellmate at the time, a former police officer convicted of murder. As a result, he is placed under special suicide watch, which includes checks every 15 minutes and the removal of sheets and other potentially dangerous objects. However, this watch is removed only 6 days later, against the judgment of a prison psychologist who recommended maintaining it, and Epstein is moved to standard monitoring status, which requires checks every 30 minutes. On the night of August 9th to 10th, 2019, his cellmate is transferred to another unit, leaving him alone, something that breaks the usual protocol for inmates under any type of special monitoring. The 2 guards assigned to monitor him do not conduct the required rounds for hours and, as they would later admit, falsify the records to make it appear that they had done so. The cameras that were supposed to record the area in front of his cell do not function properly that night, so there is no recording of the moment of his death. Epstein is found dead at 6:30 in the morning on August 10th, 2019, with a sheet tied around his neck. The official autopsy, performed by New York City's chief medical examiner Barbara Sampson, determines that the cause of death is hanging by suicide. However, the forensic pathologist hired by Epstein's family to observe the autopsy, Michael Barden, publicly states that the fractures found in the hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage of the neck are, according to his experience with thousands of cases, more common in strangulations by another person than in suicidal hangings, although he acknowledges that these fractures can also occur in some suicides, particularly in older people, as was the case with Epstein, then 66 years old. The subsequent investigation by the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, published in June 2023 after several years of work, concludes that there is no evidence of third-party involvement and attributes the death to a combination of negligence, mismanagement, and systemic failures at the detention facility, not to an organized conspiracy. The report identifies the 2 guards assigned that night, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, who instead of conducting the required rounds remain browsing the internet and sleeping at their posts for several hours, and then falsify the official records to document rounds that never occurred. Both are charged with falsifying federal documents, charges that are resolved in 2021 through an agreement that avoids prison in exchange for 100 hours of community service each. The report itself acknowledges technical failures in at least one of the cameras in the area and administrative errors in the management of the unit, without establishing a deliberate cause for those failures. Even so, the coincidence of circumstances, the partial disconnection of the cameras, the transfer of the cellmate against protocol, the suspension of special monitoring despite the psychological recommendation against it, and the guards' abandonment of their rounds fuels theories for years pointing to a possible cover-up, without any official investigation having found evidence that conclusively supports them. After Epstein's death, judicial attention shifts to Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of British media magnate Robert Maxwell, who died in circumstances also surrounded by mystery in 1991 after falling from his yacht into the Atlantic Ocean. Ghislaine is arrested in July 2020 at a property she had purchased under a false name in New Hampshire, where she had been hiding for months. She is accused of unlawful trafficking involving young individuals, conspiracy and perjury for her role in recruiting and transporting targeted individuals between 1994 and 2004. The trial, held in late 2021 in a federal court in Manhattan, included testimony from 4 individuals identified by pseudonyms who described a systematic pattern of recruitment. Maxwell identified vulnerable young individuals. Many from economically disadvantaged families gained their trust through gifts and personal attention and gradually introduced them to encounters that began as wellness sessions and escalated into severe mistreatment, both by Epstein and, in cases documented in court, by facilitating encounters with other men in their social circles. One of the witnesses, identified as Jane, testified that she was first mistreated at age 14. In December 2021, a jury found Maxwell guilty on 5 of the 6 charges she faced, including unlawful trafficking involving young individuals and conspiracy. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the harshest sentence handed down up to that point to someone directly linked to Epstein's network. Her defense appealed the sentence unsuccessfully in the following years, and Maxwell continues to serve her sentence in a federal prison in Florida. Beyond Epstein and Maxwell, dozens of people who were part of the network's machinery never faced criminal charges. Domestic workers, pilots, personal assistants, and property managers testified to investigators that they saw young individuals arrive at the various residences, but most of them were never prosecuted, partly because the prosecution prioritized building the case against the main figures, and partly because several of these employees cooperated as witnesses in exchange for partial immunity. Sarah Kellen, Nadia Marcinkova, and Adriana Ross, 3 women who worked closely with Epstein at different times and who are mentioned in court documents as possible recruiters, benefited from the 2007 immunity agreement that shielded unidentified accomplices. As a result, they were never formally charged, despite repeated mentions in witness testimonies. This point became another point of criticism of the original agreement negotiated by Acosta, since its broad wording effectively protected an unspecified number of people. In parallel, and as part of the civil proceedings stemming from the case, a compensation fund for affected individuals was established in 2020, administered independently following a model similar to that used in other major cases of institutional misconduct. The fund, financed with assets from Epstein's estate, ended up paying out more than $120 million to over 150 identified individuals between 2021 and 2022, in a process that required each applicant to document their relationship with Epstein and the hardships suffered without the need for individual litigation. Following Maxwell's conviction, public attention focused on the so-called Epstein files. Thousands of pages of court documents, flight logs, diaries, photographs, and depositions accumulated throughout the various investigations. The existence of an alleged client list, powerful men who supposedly participated in the misconduct or benefited from Epstein's network, became the subject of intense public speculation. In January 2024, a federal judge ordered the release of more court documents related to Giuffre's civil suit against Maxwell, reigniting media interest. In 2025, under the second Trump administration, who had been a friend and neighbor of Epstein for years and who had promised during his campaign to release more files on the case, Attorney General Pam Bondi suggested in a television interview that a list of Epstein's clients was on her desk. The Justice Department then distributed folders marked declassified to pro-government commentators, even though much of the information they contained was already public. On April 25, 2025, Virginia Giuffre, the survivor who for years had been the most visible voice in the case, tragically passed away in Australia at the age of 41. Her death sparked a wave of dismay among organizations supporting survivors of misconduct. In July 2025, the Department of Justice issues a statement asserting that Epstein did not maintain a client list in the formal sense, and that it will not release any more documents linked to the sex trafficking investigation, a decision that provokes a strong reaction, even among political sectors previously aligned with the government, which accuse the administration of concealing information despite having promised transparency. Public pressure grows for months, also fueled by the partial release of Epstein's emails in which various public figures are mentioned, until on November 18, 2025, the House of Representatives votes 427 votes in favor and 1 against to legally compel the full release of the case files. The Senate approves the measure shortly afterward unanimously, and Trump signs the law. At the end of January 2026, the Department of Justice begins releasing what is described as more than 3 million pages of documents, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images in one of the largest judicial declassification processes in the recent history of the United States. The department itself acknowledges months later that it must correct thousands of documents that by mistake contained identifying information about the victims, forcing partial pauses in the release. Among the released material are photographs that Epstein kept at his residence of his relationships with various public figures over the years, including Trump and Clinton, flight records confirming dozens of trips by political, business, and academic figures to his properties, and internal correspondence documenting in greater detail his financial relationship with Wexner and his attempt to rebuild his reputation after the 2008 conviction. The mere presence of a name in photographs, address books, or flight records does not, by itself, imply participation in Epstein's crimes, a distinction that the documents themselves require to be maintained carefully given the number of people mentioned. One of the most recent developments in the case occurs in February 2026, when Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former Prince Andrew of the United Kingdom, is arrested on suspicion of having shared confidential official documents with Epstein during the years in which the two maintained a friendship. The arrest marks a turning point for a figure who for years had been identified by Giuffre as one of the men with whom she was forced to have sexual relations while underage, an accusation that Andrew repeatedly denied, including in a 2019 television interview widely criticized for his lack of empathy toward the victims and which resulted in 2022 in a multi-million-dollar out-of-court civil settlement without admission of guilt, as well as the progressive loss of his military titles, patronages, and official duties as a member of the British royal family. Another of the most persistent threads surrounding Epstein's biography is an alleged connection with intelligence agencies, a rumor that has circulated since the 1980s and that neither United States nor Israeli authorities have officially and conclusively confirmed or denied. Epstein himself privately went so far as to suggest, according to the testimony of several acquaintances collected by investigative journalists, that he worked for intelligence services, a claim that he never supports with verifiable documentation beyond the Austrian passport, with a false identity found at his residence in 2019. Investigative journalist Vicky Ward recounts that a former senior White House official confirmed to her in 2017 that, during the Trump administration transition process in 2016, Acosta explained to those responsible for personnel interviews that he had been informed that Epstein belonged to some intelligence service and that for that reason he had to be left alone. This account, attributed to an anonymous source, has not been corroborated by official documents declassified to date, and Acosta himself has avoided commenting clearly on the matter in subsequent appearances. The rumor is also fueled by the figure of Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, a British media magnate who died in 1991 after falling from his yacht into Atlantic waters under circumstances that were never fully clarified, and about whom journalistic accounts circulated for years, likewise never officially confirmed linking him to Israeli intelligence services. No judicial investigation opened against Jeffrey Epstein has managed to establish a proven operational connection with intelligence agencies of any country, so this matter remains, for the time being, in the realm of journalistic speculation supported by isolated indications and not that of a judicially established fact. Although the bulk of the judicial investigations focuses on crimes committed in Florida, New York, and the United States Virgin Islands, various testimonies and documents point to a broader geographical scope. Victims and employees describe organized trips to properties and events in France, where Epstein maintained an apartment in Paris, and connections with modeling agencies, and to the United Kingdom linked to Epstein and Maxwell's relationship with the circles surrounding the British royal family. In 2020, the French prosecutor's office opens a preliminary investigation into possible underage French victims following complaints from several women who state that they had been contacted by modeling agencies with connections to Epstein during the 1990s and 2000s. The investigation, however, does not result in formal charges due in part to the expiration of the statute of limitations for many of the reported crimes under the French legislation in force at the time of the events. Zorro Ranch in Stanley, New Mexico, occupies a singular place in Epstein's biography. Acquired in the 1990s and expanded through the purchase of adjoining land until it exceeded 9,000 hectares, the ranch includes a main residence of more than 2,600 square meters. Former employees tell investigators that they regularly saw young women arriving at the ranch, and Epstein privately commented to several acquaintances according to journalistic investigations, on an interest in using the property for human genetic enhancement experiments through insemination with his own genetic material, a project that never materializes but illustrates the scale of the personal ambitions surrounding Epstein beyond the strictly financial sphere. The Paris apartment, located in one of the city's most exclusive areas, and the Palm Beach estate known as El Brillo complete a map of properties that Epstein uses interchangeably depending on the time of year and the convenience of his travel, always facilitated by his own fleet of private aircraft, which includes the Boeing 727, popularly known as the Lolita Express by the press from 2003 onward. Epstein's judicial history also includes civil lawsuits filed against third parties over alleged abuse that occurred within his environment. Proceedings that in several cases end up being withdrawn by the plaintiffs themselves or resolved through confidential settlements without a judicial determination of guilt. Alan Dershowitz, one of the lawyers who negotiated the 2007 agreement, is identified by Giuffre as one of the people with whom she was forced to have sexual relations while underage, an accusation that Dershowitz has systematically and repeatedly denied, and which led to cross-defamation lawsuits between both parties that were ultimately settled out of court in 2022 without admission of liability by either party. The combination of wealth, political power, and systematic abuse turns the Epstein case into one of the most persistent media phenomena of the last decade. Between 2019 and 2026, multiple documentaries, series, and investigative books are produced that reconstruct different angles of the case, from the Miami Herald's original work to productions focused specifically on the testimony of the victims or the financial analysis of his fortune. This sustained interest over time is explained in part by the fragmentary nature of the available information. Each new batch of court documents, each statement from a victim, and each journalistic investigation adds pieces to a puzzle that is never fully completed, keeping public interest alive long after the death of its principal protagonist. The mass release of files in 2026 renews that interest by documenting and confirming episodes that for years had circulated only as rumor or unverified testimony, while at the same time leaving unresolved some of the central questions that motivated the opening of the case 2 decades earlier. 2 days before dying, Epstein signs a new will that transfers the entirety of his estate, then valued at slightly more than $577 million, to a trust called the 1953 Trust, administered by 2 of his closest associates for decades, lawyers Darren Indyke and Richard Kahn. The speed with which the document is signed barely 48 hours before his death arouses suspicion among the authorities of the United States Virgin Islands, which in 2020 file a lawsuit against both administrators, accusing them of having facilitated for years the operation of Epstein's trafficking network in their territory, including the transportation of victims, the management of the accounts used to make payments, and the administration of the properties where the abuse occurred. Indyke and Kahn deny having direct knowledge of the crimes, claiming that their role was limited to the financial and legal administration of Epstein's assets. The dispute is finally resolved in 2022 through an agreement that allocates $105 million from Epstein's estate to the Virgin Islands, together with the transfer of Little St. James and Great St. James, the neighboring island that Epstein had acquired in 2016 with the intention, according to internal documents, of building a luxury hotel complex that never materializes. The total value of the estate, which had been estimated at more than $630 million shortly after his death, declines to approximately $240 million by the beginning of 2021, once payments resulting from the various civil lawsuits, the settlements with the Virgin Islands, and the legal costs accumulated over years of litigation are deducted. The Epstein case leaves, even after the mass release of documents, several unresolved questions. The first is the exact origin of his fortune. Despite the documented connections with Wexner, no public record fully explains how a former teacher without formal banking experience ended up managing hundreds of millions of dollars without a known client portfolio or a transparent financial structure. The second question revolves around the never officially confirmed rumors of possible connections between Epstein and intelligence services. The discovery of the false Austrian passport and statements from acquaintances who claim to have heard him say that he worked for intelligence agencies fuel this hypothesis, although no official investigation has conclusively corroborated such a connection. The third is whether or not a client list exists in the strict sense, a single document identifying the men who allegedly participated directly in the abuse. The Department of Justice denies its formal existence, while various victims' organizations and investigative journalists maintain that the network of complicity was more diffuse, spread across address books, flight records, and testimonies scattered throughout thousands of pages, rather than concentrated in a single document. The fourth, and the one that generates the greatest controversy, remains Epstein's death in his cell. The coincidences in the surveillance failures that night, documented by the official investigation itself, coexist with the formal conclusion that there was no third-party involvement, leaving a space between what the forensic evidence confirms and what the chain of negligence suggests. A fifth question, less publicly discussed but present in much of the court documentation, is the true extent of the circle of people who knew, suspected, or benefited from Epstein's network without directly participating in the abuse. The distance between having been present in a photograph, on a flight, or at a dinner, and having been an active accomplice in the crimes is precisely the territory where most of the legal and media disputes that the case continues to generate years after the death of its protagonist are concentrated. 20 years after the first complaint in Palm Beach, and with millions of pages of documents already in the public domain, the Jeffrey Epstein case continues to generate new revelations, new judicial proceedings, and new questions about how a man without inherited wealth or public office was able to build over 3 decades a network of abuse sustained by money, institutional silence, and direct access to some of the most powerful people in the world.